Hey guys, welcome to Hughes History. I got a lesson on tap for you today. Now, most of us have heard of the 1950s Red Scare, McCarthyism, kind of this fear of communism that kind of went after innocent Americans and charged them with things that they didn't do. Now, what most people don't know was there was another scare going on at the same time that had a much more pragmatic effect in terms of the people that it affected, leading to the dismissal of thousands of federal employees and a ban on certain kinds of federal employees for the next 30 or 40 years. So let's take a look not at the Red Scare, but the Lavender Scare. So get ready for a big bowl of learning as we go feed ourselves right about now. So what was the Lavender Scare? The Lavender Scare was sort of part of the Red Scare that affected thousands of homosexuals, gays and lesbians that were working for the federal government. Now I want to draw a little bit of context because not a lot is known about this history, because unlike other identity groups, histories are written down. This is a history of people that are living secret lives and that are not going public and not talking about their experiences. But what we do know is in the Roaring 20s, there were a lot of homosexuals that have always existed that moved from small towns to large towns during the Roaring 20s that kind of lived their lifestyle in secret, and they were kind of allowed to do that. Now, states had sodomy laws, and certainly there were raids on bars and people went to jail, but especially in Washington, D.C., there was kind of a culture of silent acceptance. But all of that's going to change when we get to post-World War II America. Now, in terms of culture, homosexuality is by no means accepted. The American Psychiatric Association had declared it a mental disease, and you can get fired from your job, and you really wouldn't be able to live your life as a gay man or a lesbian. Executive Order 9835 is really the beginning of the Red Scare under the Truman administration, a Democratic administration. So they instituted loyalty oaths where people would have to swear that they weren't a communist and they weren't what was called, quote, un-American. And it's really kind of that un-American label that's going to be widened to include anybody who's a subversive, anybody who rejects what we call middle-class values. And certainly gays and lesbians are going to fall into that category. But the Red Scare is really going to get ramped up in the early 1950s, late 1940s, under Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin, who's going to claim that the State Department has 205 communists working for them. Now, what most people don't know is that there weren't communists really that were thrown out of the State Department and were really found to be communists. But what did happen immediately was 95 gays and lesbians were dismissed from their jobs at the State Department in 1950. And by the time that Eisenhower is going to come in, that number is going to reach almost 1,000. Now, it's going to be Dwight Eisenhower, the Republican president, and remember that McCarthy is a Republican as well, that really see kind of this issue kind of clear cut. That not only are you probably a subversive if you're gay or lesbian, and maybe that's the way that you live your life because you have to kind of live your life in secret, and that you're not kind of accepting what would be called American values, so you're un-American and maybe that's communist. But it's also thought that you're going to be susceptible to blackmail, that the Russians are going to be able to use this secret on you in order to get you to be a spy, to work for the government, and to get the secrets out. Now, there were multiple reports from different agencies in the late 40s and the early 1950s, including a congressional committee, that found this to be true. Now, there are no recorded examples, there's no data, there's no proof, but the word on the street is that if you're a gay and lesbian and you're working for the federal government, you're putting the United States in danger. Now, Dwight Eisenhower is going to throw the gauntlet down with Executive Order 10450, which is basically what's going to ban gays and lesbians from working for the federal government. And there are thousands of employees, map makers and diplomats and undersecretaries, people that are working for the government that are going to lose their jobs, and they're going to be outed. Which means they're never going to be able to work for the federal government again, and in many cases, they're going to lose their families, they're going to lose their lives. Now, what's sort of ironic about this whole situation is that Joseph McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin, who is on this rampage to find subversives, on Americans, communists, which include now gays and lesbians, is that his attorney in the committee is going to be Roy Cohn. If you want to Google Roy Cohn, you can find out that he's also Donald Trump's mentor. But he was a vicious lawyer who, fought tooth and nail for his clients. But he was also a closeted homosexual who later would pass away from AIDS in the 1980s. Now, this whole operation in the early 50s is going to be supported by J. Edgar Hoover, and there's also evidence that shows that he might have been a closeted homosexual as well. So if you want irony, there you go, write it down. Now, while the Red Scare is going to quietly die out and go away as we get, into the late 50s and early 60s, not so much for gays and lesbians. That federal ban is going to exist, at least in the military, until the 1990s, when Bill Clinton is going to rescind that with the don't ask, don't tell policy, where you can be gay as long as you don't tell anybody. And there are going to be some limited court wins and some civil rights issues in the 1960s and the 1970s that are going to protect gays in some states. But there is no federal legislation that exists to this day that protects gays and lesbians from being fired from their job. In fact, there are 22 states right now where you can be dismissed because of being gay or lesbian. So let's see if we can find some silver linings. And certainly out of that exodus of gay and lesbian professionals from the federal government, that's a brain drain. You're losing a lot of talented professionals that now can't find work in the federal government. And many of them are going to put their talents behind the gay civil rights movement, which is really going to begin in the early 1960s. Now, there was a map maker that worked for the United States Army, Frank Kameny, who lost his job being a map maker. He couldn't find work, and he's really seen as one of the first gay civil rights leaders. In fact, he organizes the first kind of national gay and lesbian boycott, which happens in Washington, D.C., 5 years before Stonewall. This is like 1964, 1965. And you're also going to have organizations that are going to take foothold as a reaction to this in the early 1950s. One organization was called the Mattachine Society. This was led by Harry Hay. Now, Harry Hay happened to be a member of the Communist Party, so they politely asked him to step aside. It didn't look real good for those guys. That organization is going to continue to spread and kind of become part of other organizations as the gay civil rights movement takes hold, in those early decades, but really doesn't take off until later in the 70s, the 1980s, and even, into the 1990s, of course. You also had societies for lesbians, like the Daughters of Bilitis, but whenever there is kind of pressure on a civil rights group, there usually is some type of opposite reaction, and that's going to be this movement. So the Lavender Scare, thousands of Americans lost their jobs for being gays and lesbians in the federal government, and countless others were never able to serve because of those executive orders and the ramifications that occurred because of the Red Scare. So there you go, guys. We hope that you learned a little bit about not the Red Scare, but the Lavender Scare. And certainly we hope that you watch some other videos, and we're going to see if we can pump out some more content as time progresses. So now you know what I'm going to say if you've watched any of my other videos, and I mean it with all my heart, guys. Where attention goes, energy flows. We'll see you, my learning friends, next time that maybe you press my button.